She could see it in the way conversations paused a half-second too long before resuming, in the way Lady Compton turned her shoulder, not rudely, not obviously, but precisely enough to communicate everything without saying a word. In the way the younger women near the east window glanced at her and then glanced away, as if looking too long might implicate them in something they didn't yet understand. Vivienne understood it perfectly. She had been here before, not in this room, not at this particular gala, but in this exact moment. The moment just before a carefully constructed lie becomes accepted truth. The moment when a woman has perhaps 40 seconds to decide whether she will shrink or whether she will stand so completely, so quietly, so absolutely still, that the room has no choice but to recalibrate around her. She chose still. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray, not because she wanted it, but because a woman holding a glass looks like a woman who belongs, and she moved into the room at exactly the pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and nothing urgent to prove. Lord Percival Dune had spent 4 months building this trap. He had started with whispers, small ones, the kind that don't sound like accusations because they're framed as concern. "I do hope Miss Ashcroft is well." The pressures of her position at the Whitmore collection must be considerable. One hears things, of course. One tries not to listen. He was masterful at that particular brand of cruelty, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. Then had come the documentation, 2 letters allegedly in her hand, suggesting she had been privately selling acquisition assessments to competing collectors, that she had been taking money to steer the Whitmore collection's purchases in directions that benefited her own private clients, that everything she had built over 6 years, every relationship, every evaluation, every careful negotiation, had been a performance designed to enrich herself at the institution's expense. The letters were forgeries. She had known they were forgeries the moment Lord Dune's associate had shown them to the Whitmore's board 3 weeks ago, because she knew exactly where she had been on the dates those letters were allegedly written, and she knew exactly what her handwriting looked like under genuine duress versus what it looked like when someone with a steady hand and a very good eye tried to replicate it under no duress at all. The loop on her lowercase g closed slightly differently when she was tired. It was a small thing, it was everything. She had spent 3 weeks not defending herself, not publicly, not yet, because a woman who defends herself before the accusation has fully landed looks guilty of the accusation, and Vivienne Ashcroft had not survived 6 years as the only woman in rooms full of men who believed expertise was inherited by bloodline rather than built by relentless, unglamorous work, by making mistakes of timing. She had spent those 3 weeks building. Tonight, she was finished building. She took a slow sip of champagne she didn't taste, let her eyes move across the room with the unhurried precision of someone cataloguing a gallery, and found Lord Percival Dune standing near the centre of the ballroom, laughing at something the Earl of Sutton had said. He hadn't seen her yet. She gave him another 30 seconds. Then she began to move. The Winter Gala at Hartwell Manor was one of those events that existed primarily to remind everyone in attendance of the precise distance between themselves and everyone else. It was held every year in the 3rd week of December, hosted by the Countess of Hartwell, a woman of 71 who had outlived 2 husbands, 3 political scandals, and the certainty of everyone who had ever underestimated her, and it functioned less as a celebration than as a performance. The correct people attended, the correct conversations were had, the correct alliances were quietly reinforced or quietly severed, and by the time the last carriage rolled away after midnight, the social architecture of the season had been established with the kind of efficiency that no formal council could have achieved. Vivienne Ashcroft had attended for the first time 4 years ago as a guest of the Whitmore Collection's director, and she had spent most of that first evening standing near the windows with a glass she kept forgetting to drink from, watching the room with the same attention she gave to a piece of art she hadn't yet decided how to evaluate. She had catalogued the power structures, the allegiances, the careful performances of indifference that were actually the most intense form of attention. She had gone home and written 6 pages of notes that she never showed anyone. The 2nd year, she had been invited in her own right. That had meant something then. It meant something still, even now. perhaps especially now when Lord Percival Dune had done everything within his considerable power to ensure it would mean nothing by the end of the evening. Vivian was 31 years old. She had a first-class education that had taken her family to the edge of financial ruin to provide, a 6-year tenure at the Whitmore Collection that had resulted in 4 major acquisitions that were now considered defining pieces of the institution's identity, and a reputation for evaluative precision that had made her, in quiet professional circles, one of the most sought-after eyes in the country. She had none of the things that the room around her considered prerequisite for her level of success. She had no family title, no inherited connections, no husband whose name she could borrow when a room decided her own wasn't sufficient. What she had was the ability to look at a thing, a painting, a document, a situation, and understand it more completely than the person who created it. Lord Percival Dune had discovered this the hard way 18 months ago, when Vivian had quietly and professionally assessed a piece he'd been attempting to sell to the Whitmore Collection as a 17th-century Dutch original, and had determined with meticulous documentation that it was a very skilled 19th-century imitation. The Whitmore had declined the purchase. Dune had lost £40,000 in expected profit, and more critically, a significant amount of the credibility he'd spent years cultivating as a connoisseur. He was not a man who accepted professional correction from women he considered beneath him. He was, however, a man who planned carefully and waited patiently. Vivian had understood, from the moment the first whispers reached her, that this was not impulsive retaliation. This had been constructed. She had respected that in the grim way one respects a well-executed threat. Near the fireplace on the room's north wall, Duke Aldrich Voss stood with a glass of something amber that he had not touched since it was placed in his hand 40 minutes ago. He was not easy to describe, which was itself a description of a kind. He was tall enough that the room arranged itself slightly around him, but he didn't impose. He simply occupied space with such complete and unself-conscious authority that the space seemed to accept him without negotiation. His hair was dark, cut with the kind of unfussy precision that suggested someone who made decisions about appearance once and did not revisit them. His face was arranged in the particular expression of a man who is watching everything and commenting on nothing. He was 36. He had held the Voss dukedom for 8 years since his father's death, and in those 8 years he had developed a reputation that could be summarized in approximately 3 words, depending on who was summarizing: formidable, precise, private, or, in less charitable circles, cold, unknowable, dangerous. He had not danced once this evening. He had spoken to perhaps 4 people, all briefly, all with the particular quality of attention that made the recipient feel simultaneously seen and assessed. He had declined 3 invitations to join larger conversation groups, with nothing more than a slight movement of his eyes that communicated, with remarkable efficiency, that he was exactly where he intended to be. He was watching the room. He had noticed Vivian Ashcroft the moment she entered it, not because she was conspicuous, precisely because of how she was not. He had watched her take the champagne glass, had watched her read the room in the same 6 seconds he had given it, had watched her make the decision, and it had been a decision, he could see that clearly, could see the moment her shoulders settled into a particular kind of deliberate calm that was entirely different from actual calm, to walk into the center of it as though she owned the floor beneath her feet. Duke Aldrich Voss, who found most evenings at most galas to be exercises in patience, set his glass down very slightly on the mantelpiece behind him, and he watched. Lord Percival Dune saw her when she was 12 feet away. To his credit, and Vivian acknowledged it, because she acknowledged everything, he recovered quickly. The laugh he'd been midway through completed itself naturally. The smile stayed in place, and only someone who had been watching for the specific micro-expression of a man who has just realized his timeline has been disrupted would have caught the half-second of recalibration behind his eyes. Vivian had been watching for exactly that. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, and his voice carried the precise warmth of someone who has decided that warmth is the correct strategic choice. "I didn't expect to see you this evening." "I know," she said pleasantly. "That was something of the point." The Earl of Sutton, who had been standing beside Dune and who had clearly heard enough of the whispers to be uncertain how to arrange his face, made a sound that was attempting to be a greeting and settled for being an exhale. Vivienne gave him a small, genuine smile, because the Earl was not her enemy. He was simply a man caught in someone else's war, and then returned her attention to Dune with the unhurried patience of someone who had all evening and intended to use it. "You've been telling people," she said, still pleasantly, "that I've been conducting private assessments for outside collectors while in the Whitmore's employ, that I've been taking payment to influence acquisition decisions, that the letters your associate presented to the board are evidence of a sustained pattern of professional misconduct." Dune's smile remained. "These are serious concerns that have been raised by multiple parties. They've been raised by you," Vivienne said, "through intermediaries, which is your preferred method, and I do understand why. It's more difficult to trace and considerably more difficult to refute, because refuting a whisper requires you to first repeat it loudly enough for people to hear the refutation, which spreads it further." She tilted her head slightly. "It's actually quite elegant. I've thought about it a great deal over the past 3 weeks." Something shifted in Dune's expression. "Not much. Enough." "Miss Ashcroft," he said, dropping the warmth by several careful degrees, "this is neither the time nor the place." "It's exactly the time and place," she said, "because you chose this time and place. You've spent 4 months ensuring that by the time I walk through those doors tonight, everyone in this room would already have a version of events that made me the subject rather than the object of a fraud. You chose a social setting because social settings are where reputations are built and destroyed, and because the witnesses here cannot be formally deposed." She paused. "So yes, this is precisely the time and place. You selected it." The Earl of Sutton had taken a very small step backward. Nearby conversations had begun to quiet, not all at once, which would have been conspicuous, but in the gradual radiating way that silence spreads through a room when something more interesting than conversation is occurring. Near the fireplace, Duke Aldrich Voss had not moved. His expression had not changed, but the quality of his stillness had shifted in a way that was difficult to articulate. The difference between a man standing still because there is nothing worth watching, and a man standing still because he has found something worth watching completely. Lord Duna looked at Vivienne with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he had believed was under control. "You have no proof," he said quietly, dropping all pretense of warmth. "Whatever you think you've assembled—" "I have the letters," she said. "Both of them. I have a document analyst from the University of Edinburgh who examined them for 11 days and produced a 30-page report detailing 14 specific inconsistencies between my verified handwriting samples and the writing in those letters. I have the G." She watched him. "You didn't know about the G, did you? It's very small. Your forger was quite good. But when I write under genuine time pressure, the loop closes differently. It's been consistent across 12 years of my professional correspondence. The letters you produced show no such variation. They're too clean, too steady. Written by someone who was being very careful, which is exactly the opposite of how I write when I'm supposedly engaged in urgent, secret, professional misconduct." Dune said nothing. "I also have," Vivienne continued, in the same pleasant, even tone, "documentation of my precise whereabouts on every date those letters were allegedly written, signed receipts, train records, a letter from the director of the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Paris confirming that I was in his office on the 14th of March, which is the date on the more damning of the 2 letters, discussing a potential loan arrangement for an exhibition that will open next autumn." She paused. "I was not in London writing secret correspondence. I was in Paris doing my job." The silence in the surrounding area of the ballroom was now almost complete. Lord Percival Dune stood very still. What happened next was the part that Vivienne had not planned for, which was the first unplanned thing in 3 weeks, and it arrived in the form of Lord Dune deciding that if the ground was collapsing beneath him, he would take as much of the room down with him as possible. "A document analyst," he said, and his voice had changed, a quieter, harder, stripped of all the social performance. "Paid by you, produced on your behalf. You expect this room to accept the testimony of someone in your employ as definitive proof of—" "I don't expect this room to accept anything," Vivienne said. "I expect this room to listen, which is different. What they accept is their own decision." "You've been planning this," Idune said, and now there was something almost admiring beneath the hostility. "You've been building something, haven't you? For weeks, while everyone believed you were simply defeated?" she offered. His jaw tightened. "The analyst's credentials are independent of his engagement by me," she said. "The University of Edinburgh does not endorse fraudulent forensic reports. His methodology is documented and reproducible. Anyone in this room who wishes to commission a second opinion is welcome to do so." She paused. "I'd encourage it, actually. The results will be the same." It was at this moment that Lord Doone made the mistake that Vivian had not anticipated, but had. She realized in the half-second before it happened, perhaps unconsciously prepared for. He looked around the room, not for support exactly, more for an exit, for someone whose authority or presence might shift the weight of the moment, and his eyes landed on the Countess of Hartwell, who was standing 12 feet away with an expression of absolute composed attention, and beside the Countess stood her nephew, Mr. Thomas Ashby, who was 26 years old and who had, 7 months ago, brought a collection of private correspondence to Vivian Ashcroft for authentication. Correspondence that had belonged to his late father. Correspondence that had included 3 letters signed by Lord Percival Doone, dated 5 years ago, discussing a financial arrangement that bore a remarkable structural resemblance to the very arrangement Doone was now accusing Vivian of conducting. Thomas Ashby had not known what he had when he brought it to her. Vivian had spent 3 weeks deciding what to do with it. She had decided to do nothing with it, because it was not her correspondence, not her story to tell, and because using someone else's private grief as a weapon, even against a man who deserved it, was not something she was willing to become. But she had told Thomas Ashby what she had found. She had shown him the letters. She had given him the documentation and let him make his own decision. Thomas Ashby was currently looking at Lord Percival Doone with an expression that had very little social polish left in it, and Lord Doone, who was a man of considerable perceptive intelligence, understood in the same moment that Vivian did what was about to happen, and it was not her doing. She had not orchestrated this. She had simply been honest with a young man about what she had found in his own family's papers, and Thomas Ashby had walked into a party on the same evening she had, independently, and they had not spoken once, and the thing that was about to occur was the result of 2 separate people reaching the same conclusion by entirely different routes. "Lord Doone," Thomas Ashby said, stepping forward from beside his aunt. His voice was very steady for someone his age. "I wonder if you might explain something to me." Doone turned. "My father's estate correspondence," Ashby said. "Authenticated recently by Miss Ashcroft, at my request. She found several letters among them that I found quite interesting, letters I've since shared with my family's solicitor." He paused. "I believe you knew my father rather better than you've led people to believe." The silence in the ballroom was now total. Near the fireplace, Duke Aldrich Voss reached behind him, picked up the glass of amber liquid he hadn't touched in over an hour, and brought it slowly to his lips. He did not drink. He simply held it there, watching, with the complete and absolute attention of a man who has just witnessed something he did not expect to see in a ballroom in December. Vivienne stood in the center of the room. She had not planned this moment. She had simply been honest, weeks ago, with someone who deserved honesty, and honesty had moved through the room on its own trajectory and arrived here. She had not looked triumphant. She did not look triumphant now. She looked, the Duke thought, like someone who had built a very precise and careful structure, and then watched the weather do something the structure had been designed to withstand, and felt the specific quiet of a thing holding. Lord Percival Doone left the ballroom at 17 minutes past 10. He did not make a scene. He was too skilled for scenes. He simply had a brief, quiet conversation with the Countess of Hartwell, who listened with her hands folded and her expression revealing nothing. And then he moved toward the entrance with the measured pace of a man who has decided that the most dignified available option is departure. And he departed. The room exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically. The way a room exhales when a pressure that everyone has been pretending not to feel has finally been released. Conversations resumed. Music that had subtly declined in energy began to reassert itself, and the particular quality of the air shifted from the charged stillness of a moment before lightning to the opened quality of a moment after it. Vivienne stood very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she finished the champagne she'd been carrying for 40 minutes, set the glass on the nearest available surface, and walked toward the east window, because she needed 2 minutes in which no one was looking at her, and the east window was in a partial alcove, and the alcove was currently empty. She stood with her back to the room and looked out at the dark garden below and breathed. Her hands were steady. She noted this with a kind of distant professional interest, the way she noted details that were relevant to assessment. Her hands were steady, and her breathing was controlled, and the thing she was experiencing was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated than relief. Something that had to do with having held a very great deal of weight for a very long time, and having set it down, and discovering that setting it down felt less like lightness and more like the absence of something she had become accustomed to carrying. She heard footsteps behind her. They were not hurried. They arrived at the edge of the alcove and stopped, and then there was silence, and she did not turn around. "You knew," said a voice she didn't recognize immediately, "about the Ashby letters before tonight." She turned. Duke Aldrich Voss was standing at the entrance to the alcove. He was not quite inside it, standing at the boundary of it, which she registered as a courtesy she hadn't expected. He still held the glass. It was still full. "Yes," she said. "And you chose not to use them yourself?" It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "They weren't mine to use." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, not because it was blank, but because it was too precise, like a text in a language she was familiar with, but hadn't spoken in some time. "That was a considerable restraint," he said, "given the circumstances." "It would have worked," she said, "because there was no point in pretending otherwise. If I had presented those letters myself, alongside the handwriting analysis, it would have been thorough, and it would have been effective." She paused. "It would also have meant using a young man's private grief about his father as a tool in my professional dispute. I wasn't willing to do that, even though the dispute was serious, especially because it was serious." She looked at him steadily. "The seriousness of a situation doesn't change the ethics of how you respond to it. If anything, it—" She stopped. "I'm sorry, you didn't ask for my reasoning." "I did, actually," he said. "That was the question." She looked at him again. He was watching her with that quality of attention she'd noticed from across the room. The attention that felt less like observation and more like genuine consideration, like he was not cataloguing her, but actually thinking about what she said as she said it. "Who are you?" she said, and then immediately, "I know who you are." "That wasn't— I meant, who are you? That you're standing in an alcove asking me about my ethics at 10:15. Something moved across his face. It was brief, and it was not quite a smile, but it occupied the same space a smile would have. "Aldrich Voss," he said. "I know that." "Then perhaps the question answers itself." She studied him for a moment. "You watched the whole thing?" "Yes." "From the fireplace?" "Yes." "You didn't intervene?" "No." He paused. "You didn't need intervention." "I know," she said. "I'm not criticizing. She thought about it. "I'm noting it. Most people who watched from that distance were waiting to see which way it fell. You weren't doing that." "No," he agreed. "I wasn't." She waited, because she had learned, over 6 years of professional negotiation, that silence was an invitation, and that the person most comfortable with silence usually had more to say. "I've watched a great many people in difficult positions in that room," he said finally. "Most of them manage it by becoming smaller, by making themselves less visible, less threatening, less present, until the difficulty has passed." He looked at her. "You did the opposite. Becoming smaller wasn't an option that was going to work," she said. "Most people don't know that. Most people haven't had 6 years of practice." He nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone who has received an answer that confirms something they already suspected. "The board meeting," he said, "at the Whitmore, it's scheduled for January." She went still. "You know about the board meeting. Lord Doone has been lobbying 2 of the board members for the past 6 weeks," he said. "I know the board members. They've mentioned it." She looked at him carefully. And you're telling me this because the handwriting analysis and the Paris documentation are strong, he said, but the board meeting will be a formal proceeding. And formal proceedings have different rules than ballrooms. And the two members June has been speaking to are men who are more susceptible to sustained social pressure than to documentary evidence, and you should know that before you walk into that room. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "Because you chose not to use a weapon you had available," he said, "for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with principle, and people who operate that way—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider the sentence, began again. It seemed worth mentioning. He inclined his head, not quite a bow, something more like acknowledgement, and moved back from the alcove. He paused at the boundary of it. "The board member on the left side of the table," he said, without turning back. "His name is Alderton. He responds to written correspondence better than verbal argument. He's reviewed 4 formal complaints in his tenure and ruled based on documentation in all 4 cases. If you write to him directly before the meeting—" A pause. "That's likely to be useful." Then he walked back into the ballroom, and Vivian stood in the alcove with a small piece of information that was worth considerably more than its size suggested, and thought about a man who had stood near a fireplace for over an hour watching a room, and had chosen to mention something he didn't have to mention, and had done it in an alcove where no one could see it. She stood there for a long moment. Then she straightened, smoothed the front of her dress with one hand and walked back into the ballroom. The January board meeting of the Whitmore collection lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. Vivian had written to board member Alderton on the 29th of December, a formal, precise 12-page letter that addressed every documented point of the allegations against her, included the forensic analysis report in full, attached certified copies of her Paris travel documentation, and made no emotional appeal of any kind. She had stated facts. She had cited sources. She had written it the way she wrote evaluations, which was the only way she knew how to write anything that mattered. Alderton had written back in 4 days, which was, she'd been told, faster than he'd ever responded to professional correspondence. His letter had been brief. It had said that he looked forward to the meeting, and that he had reviewed her documentation with considerable interest. She had taken that and held it carefully and not read too much into it, because she had learned, over the course of 6 years, that anticipating good outcomes was a form of inattention to the work still required. The board meeting proceeded in the order she had expected. The allegations were formally presented. The documentary evidence she'd submitted was reviewed. The forensic report was discussed. There had been, as she'd predicted, an attempt by one of the members to question the independence of the analyst, and she had come prepared with 3 independent verifications of his methodology from institutions that had no connection to her whatsoever, and the attempt had died quietly in the face of them. The Paris documentation had not been questioned. The G had, in the end, been the thing that settled it. Not because it was the most dramatic piece of evidence, but because it was the most specific. Fraud is difficult to prove in the abstract. A forger who didn't know that a particular person's lowercase g closes differently under time pressure is a forger who left a specific, documentable, irrefutable trace. The board had passed the forensic report around the table. They had looked at her handwriting samples. They had looked at the letters. The vote had been 4-1 in her favor. The one dissenting vote was a man whose primary qualification for the board was a significant financial donation made 8 years ago. And Vivian had noted it, and filed it, and moved on, because 4-1 was sufficient, and sufficient was what she'd built toward. She received the formal notification of her reinstatement on a Thursday afternoon in her office. She'd continued to come in every day during the period of formal review, because the review was of her conduct and not of her contract, and stopping would have looked like guilt. And she read it twice, set it on her desk, and sat very quietly for approximately 4 minutes. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the evaluation she'd been in the middle of when the notification arrived. It was a piece being considered for acquisition, a small oil-on panel, allegedly 16th century Flemish school. She had been suspicious of the craquelure pattern for 3 days. She had a theory about the ground layer that she wanted to test against a technical analysis she'd requested from conservation. She worked until 6 o'clock. She did not see Duke Aldrich Voss again until the spring exhibition opening at the Whitmore in March, which he attended as a lender. 2 pieces from the Voss collection were included in the show, and which Vivian was hosting in her official capacity as the collection's senior curator. She was standing beside the first of the 2 Voss pieces when he arrived, a 17th-century maritime scene that she had spent several genuinely enjoyable hours with during the loan negotiation process. And she was in the middle of explaining something about the painter's use of light to a group of 3 guests when she noticed him enter. She finished the explanation. The guests moved on. He came to stand beside her in front of the painting. "The board meeting," he said by way of greeting. 4-1, she said. "I heard." He looked at the painting. "Alderton. Wrote to him on the 29th, she said, "as suggested. And the result was, as suggested." He said nothing for a moment. They stood together looking at the maritime scene, at the way the painter had rendered the light on water, with a confidence that had taken Vivian 3 separate examinations to fully understand. "It's better in person," he said. "Almost everything is," she said. He glanced at her sideways. She kept her eyes on the painting. "The second piece is in the North Gallery," she said. "The portrait. I think you'll find it's been hung better than you expected. We had a conversation about the sightline. I won." "I'm sure you did," he said. She looked at him then. He was looking at the painting, and the expression on his face was the one she'd seen in the alcove, the one that wasn't quite a smile but occupied its space, and was somehow more telling for what it wasn't. "Thank you," she said, "for Alderton." "I mentioned a name," he said. "You mentioned the right name," she said, "at the right time. That's not a small thing." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." They stood together in front of the painting for another moment. A maritime scene, calm water, difficult light rendered with confidence, built slowly and precisely by someone who had studied the problem for longer than most people would have been willing to study it. Then the next group of guests arrived, and Vivian turned to welcome them, and Duke Aldrich Voss moved toward the North Gallery, and the evening continued around them both with the unhurried elegance of things that have found their correct arrangement. 3 weeks after the exhibition closed, a letter arrived at the Whitmore collection addressed to Vivian Ashcroft. It contained no salutation and no signature. It contained 1 sentence. "The Voss Library holds 17 pieces currently unattributed. If you are ever interested in looking at them, the library is open on Thursdays." She read it twice. She set it in the top drawer of her desk, where she kept the things she intended to think about carefully before deciding. On Thursday, she took the train north. She brought her notebooks. She brought her magnifying glass. She brought the particular quality of attention she brought to things that deserved it. She did not bring expectations. She had learned over 6 years of looking closely at difficult and beautiful things that expectations were a form of looking at what you wanted to see rather than what was there. What was there when she arrived was a library with 17 unattributed pieces and very good light, and a man who was already there when she arrived, standing at a window with a book he may or may not have been reading, who looked up when she entered and said nothing, and moved to the other side of the room and sat down. She looked at the first painting for a long time. Outside, the light moved across the floor the way light does in old buildings, slowly, with intention, as though it had been practicing this particular path for centuries. Neither of them spoke, neither of them needed to. Fine.